Hi everybody, thank you for joining us this afternoon and welcome to this Chem Showcase webinar titled Power Up Your School Performance. My name is Gemma Valpy, I'm the Head of Business Development for Chem here in the UK, and I'm joined today by John Bunyan. So John's going to present for us today. John's our Business Development Manager at Chem and he's been working in education since 2010. He's held senior positions in assessment, education, training technology, consulting and media, and with a passion for lifelong learning, John achieved his MBA from Durham in 2007. John is a passionate advocate of using data insight for effective decision making in schools, and he's going to be talking you through baseline assessments today, so a basic introduction to baseline assessments, the Chem assessments and the adaptive nature and the benefits of adaptive nature of the tests from Chem, and then also what you can do with the data. So most importantly, how you as teachers can then use the data effectively within schools. We have got a couple of housekeeping points. So we have got you all in listen only mode today. If you ask questions, but we would love you to ask questions as we go through the presentation. There should be a section on the right-hand side of your screen called questions. You can post anything you like and we'll answer them all at the end of the webinar. You'll also have 2 emails from us following the webinar. The first will just be your certificate of attendance, and then we'll be sending on a recording of this. So if you want to revisit it or share it, you can do so. So John, I'm going to hand over to you now, and please do post your questions as we go. Thank you very much.
That's lovely. Thanks, Gemma. Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this showcase webinar. My name is John Bunyan, as Gemma has said, the Business Development Manager here at Chem. I've talked to schools all the way around the world, including the UK. Today, we're going to be discussing a little bit about the introduction to baseline assessments, some of the benefits of adaptive testing over static testing or traditional testing. There's benefits to both, but we'll explain those a little bit further on. What teachers can do with the data. Ultimately, that's why we're here. Why test otherwise? We want to know what we can do with it. The worst thing you want to do is do work, write a report, and have it collecting dust on a shelf doing nothing. So what are the benefits from doing these assessments? We're going to take some questions and answers at the end. So as Gemma says, if you've got any questions, and if you're anything like me, please don't try and save them up towards the end. Get them written down in the comments box, and we'll get to them at the end. Okay. So let's have a look. So I thought we'd start with a good pie chart. Everybody loves a pie chart, don't we? It's around the missing piece, and I know this sounds really simple, but any journey's got at least 2 points. It's got a start and it's got an end. Now, we're all really familiar with the curriculum and you know, the end point, and we're all really familiar with the wide range of concepts and the content that we need to teach, and obviously the resources that we've got to help support that as we're going through. Now, all that aside, we end up starting with this assumption that we're working with, you know, the buckets that we've got. The students that we've got are all empty, and we just need to fill them. But as we all know, not all buckets are the same, and using that same method of pouring to all of the buckets is going to yield pretty inconsistent results at best. So what am I talking about? Well, I thought I'd start with a little story about training year, my training year when I trained to teach. And I know that's taking us a long way back, but if you bear with me. Now, I came to teaching a little bit late, as you probably tell, as Gemma said before. And when I came to teach, then I ended up supporting the head of year 7, a lady called Anne. And Anne used to look after transition, as you probably imagine, quite natural. Now, Anne sat me down, she knew my background, and we sat down together to work through all of the information that she got given regarded from all of her feeder schools. And we ended up with about a dozen spreadsheets, a dozen feeder schools. And these spreadsheets came in a wide variety of colours, shapes, fonts, sizes, data types, data formats. Columns were in different places. And what was really quite bizarre and interesting to me is that Anne was mentally applying a filter to each and every one of these spreadsheets as we went along. This school's a bit generous, this school's a bit pessimistic, this school's about right. And so she was applying a very subjective filter based on her experience to what should have been quite objective data coming through. And to me, given my background, this sounded crazy. And this is where we started thinking, well, there must be a better way of doing this. And this is where I think many of you might have heard of Chem in the past, previous webinars, and what we've got in here. So what we have when we get through this, this missing piece that we keep talking about is trying to provide a bit of objectivity, some independence to that gap, that piece in terms of what was missing at the start. Now, as I said, the piece that we're trying to fit here, and one of the reasons why it's a pie chart, is that they are very distinct pieces. It's what we do at Chem, but we don't try and replace anything that you've got within the process. We try and supplement it, we try and support it, we try and give an objective baseline from which you can then use to hang the rest of your data on. Because you all know where you're going, that's the end goal. You all know the tools that you've got to get there, but we've got to help you provide an objective starting point and a framework to give you context for the rest of your data. Now, if the baseline, if you like, is that starting point, and you've got your rest of your formative, which I know you're going to do a lot of as you go through the year. So that's the content. So that's what you're putting into the bucket. If you can imagine the bucket itself, we're going to tell you what the shape and the size of all the buckets are. If they've got holes in the side of them. And because of all of this, you're going to know whether you need to put your finger in the side of a bucket, or you're going to need to provide, you've got a particularly able group, so you're going to need to provide additional challenge activities, or you've got some very complex needs that you can identify very, very quickly that may not be highlighted at the start of the year. Point is, one of the little bits of advice anyway that Anne used to give me was that never smile before Christmas. Now, it always made me smile a little bit, but Anne's point here that she was trying to make was that the first term that you've got your students is a voyage of discovery. It's a voyage of discovery for you because you're trying to get to know your students and their ways that they like to learn, and their needs and their strengths and their weaknesses. But it's also a journey for them. So they get to know how you like to work, your boundaries, and what it's like to be in your classroom. So there's this balancing act as you both learn, but there's this journey as you both learn throughout it. And what we're trying to do in this scenario is shortcut a little bit this process, this first term, this never smile before Christmas. Because I've talked to lots and lots of teachers, and there's not a single one of them that's turned around to me and said, you know what, I've got too much time with my students, I think I can give some of it back. Now, what we want to try and do is give you some more information earlier. Now, if we can do that, we can give you that insight a little bit earlier. And if you've got insight into the strengths and the weaknesses and the challenges that you've got in the classroom that little bit earlier, then you can do something about it a little bit earlier. And the sooner you can start putting interventions in place that are both objective and reasonable, the sooner you can actually start trying to make a difference in the classroom and addressing some of those development needs, or even the strengths to make sure that you've got adequate challenge in the classroom. That's going to help benefit both the behaviour within the classroom and also the results that you're going to get out of it as well. So let's talk a bit about baseline. So what is it? Well, the baseline, if you look in any dictionary, is in a very short form, a clearly defined starting point. And it's not specific to teaching, it's absolutely all walks of life. The good ones, as I learned a long time ago, are objective and robust, but also they're really quick and easy to do, so that you can repeat them consistently and you can create that consistent benchmark. Now, in the context of it, in the context of your school, what we are starting to measure, what we want to measure, are the core skills and abilities that we know are really important to that academic success. Really important point to note here, we're not trying to measure the content of a curriculum. We're not trying to measure how much you've poured into the bucket. You're going to do that all the way through the year on a regular basis, and we're not trying to repeat that. There's no value to that. What we're trying to do is give you some additional information right at the beginning of that journey. That journey is going to give you the strengths and the weaknesses, the buckets, if you like, so that you know how you can adjust your pouring, or whether or not, as I said, you need to put a finger in the side of the bucket. Now, baselines are usually delivered at the start of a journey. Now, but the start of a journey is often quite a simplistic term when you start thinking about it. Really what it means is if there's been any break. So if there's been a break in the journey, if there's a gap in data that you might have, or if you've got a lack of confidence in the data that you've got. Think of the various different feeder schools that I've got and we had to filter through the spreadsheets for, or perhaps it's simply inconsistent, not just in terms of its format, but in terms of actually the subjective nature in which it was put together in a lot of cases. Now, what does this mean in your context? Well, I'll take you through a very broad assessment cycle anyway, and this is something that's very common to all walks of life and all businesses. We used to use something very simple. You're faced with a situation, and your situation or a problem. You decide whether or not you have enough information, enough insight, enough data to make an informed decision. Okay? If you don't, then you need to go and find the data, which means you usually need to go and test something or assess something. So, and this is where we are. So you assess, you do lots of assessment. The assessment gives you raw data, so you get a mountain of data. And schools, just like the businesses that I started my career in, are data generating machines. You have an absolute mountain of it, which creates its own challenges. Because then, obviously, once you've got that mountain of data, you need to analyze it. And you analyze it so that you can start to bring out some of the insights from it. Because data on its own won't really tell you anything. You need to be able to put it into context. You need to analyze it. And importantly as well, and this is why the three segments of the pie that we looked at before are really, really important to look at them in separate entities, because if you take each one of those items, whether that's a baseline or whether that's curriculum knowledge or whether that's behavior in a classroom, you look at any one of them in isolation, they only ever tell part of the story. And what you really need is you need all the pieces of the story, because that then fills in all the gaps. That then starts to explain why something might be a certain way. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand and test where we think our expectations might differ from what's actually happening. And if our expectations differ from what's actually happening, what can we do about it? And that's where we start moving on. So we assess. We'll use the formative, diagnostic, whatever. It might be groups of students, it might be individuals. We analyze it, so we've got that objective measure. We test our assumptions in there. We identify those potential learning gaps. And then obviously, once we've got all of that and we've made sense out of it and we understand it and we think we've got it right, then we start to create our plans. We can set realistic and challenging targets for our students. We can put realistic and tailored and informed interventions in place based on the objective data that we've got. It's none of it, it's very little finger in the air. We can start putting a finger in the air, but really what we want to do after that is test it to make sure that we're going in the right direction. Now, once we've made our plan, we need to put it into action. And that's where the teach bit comes in. And that's something that we're all really familiar with. So we get on and teach, and we use all of the things that we've done. We put our plans into action and we get on with it and teach. Okay? And we use the data that we've got to support that professional judgment in the classroom so that you can target those resources as effectively as you possibly can. Then obviously you can shape your teaching, you can differentiate your practice within the classroom. If you've got a classroom full of gifted students, then you make sure you've got lots of challenge activities ready. If you've got more students with needs in the classroom, then you make sure you've got more writing mats or writing frames there ready for them to go. You've got more data, you've got more interventions, or even possibly teaching assistant in the classroom to help support you. You've got all of this ready. Everything is going together. And then obviously you reach the end of that process, you've done all of the teaching, and you could sit down and do your lessons learned. Okay? Because we don't just finish the year and then move on and forget about it. We want to learn from it. What have we done? And so this is our reflect point. So we plan, do, plan, do, act, reflect, and then we go around that circle, because we're going to take that reflection and we're going to feed it into that process at the start when we look to assess again in the future. Because then we want to evolve, we want to adapt, we want to refine our practice, we want to share our best practice with colleagues, we want our colleagues to share their best practice with us, because we want to do more of what works and less of what doesn't. And being able to measure all of this, obviously, helps you evidence what you're doing and say, okay, well, what I did do was right, or what I did do, possibly wasn't quite so right, and I need to work on that and adapt it moving forward. If you can imagine it, and a really simple example would be, you screw up a ball of paper and you throw it at the bin in the corner, and you throw it at the bin in the corner, but it falls short. Yeah. Okay. So the next time you screw up a ball of paper and you throw it towards the bin, what do? Do you throw it the same way? Well, no, because you reflect on what you've done and you adapt what you did. So that the next time you throw it, you're going to throw it a bit harder, and hopefully this time you get it in the bin. And this is going to be the same with what we do in the classroom, because we want to adapt and refine our practice, because yes, it's not going to be the same, and it's like nailing jelly to a wall and the goalposts move on a regular basis and the students change. But if our practice evolves and develops, then we can evolve and develop frameworks and interventions that are going to help support that journey. It's going to take some of the stress, some of the time, some of the work out of it for us. We're going to make it easier for ourselves. So speaking of easy, we're looking at baseline assessments for specific age groups. So we've got a suite of 6 assessments here that we're looking at for our baselines. And you can see here, we're right the way from ages 3 years old, from right the way from nursery and early years, where we've got story-based teacher-led assessments that are really very specific to that particular stage of education, right the way through the rest of primary, right the way through into secondary, where we start to predict to future outcomes at GCSE, and then we get to post-16 and we're predicting to future outcomes at A, AS, and even IB. So you might think, well, why have we got 6? Why have we got 6? Well, I think, just as I'm sure you know, that all the students at different stages and the ages that we've got, we want to test different things, because they're at different stages, and those insights that we want to gather from the different stages are going to be quite different. So we want to know different things at different places. So for example, in base, we want to know if the students know their letters by now. Can they count up to 10? Do they know their shapes? And by the time you've reached secondary or 16, you're pretty confident that the student's going to know their letters, but you're really interested in how their vocabulary's developed over that time, and how numerate they are, and how mentally nimble they might have developed into. So journey is not a straight one. And so the assessments that we've got to support that journey reflect that in what we try and provide you. We want to try and give you the most objective and independent suite of assessments relevant to that particular stage that we possibly can. So, as I said, objective and independent and robust. This is what we want to be able to do, because if you've got something that's objective, independent and consistent, it means that you can use that year on year, stage on stage, and then you can look at the data that comes in, and your data might come from a variety of consistent or inconsistent areas. You may need to do bespoke ad hoc bits of research or assessments, because there happens to be another gap that wasn't there last time. But if you've got something objective, independent, consistent right the way through, it means that you're going to be able to hang those different bits of research on. And that objective, independent, consistent baseline is going to help put that rest of that data into context. Now, as I've said here, we're 100% digital these days. Very green, I know, but I'm pretty sure everybody's going to say that these days. But what that means from your point of view is we don't need to mess around with paper security. It means we don't have to mark things. You don't have to mark things. Importantly, it all comes back to us, and we send you the reports back. So all you need to do is take the insights from the data and put it into action for you. So no teacher marking. Because it's digital, because it's online, it's really fast and flexible, and it caters for all the ability levels right the way through 3 through to 18 plus as well. Now, it's adaptive as well, and this is something quite unique to Chem. Now, what do I mean by adaptive? Adaptive's something you either know or you don't at this point. And so what do I mean by adaptive in this particular context? So, well, if you can imagine a traditional test, so I've got that bottom right hand corner. If you can imagine a traditional test, in order to cater for all of the ability levels that you have within your cohort, you need to ask a lot of questions. In order to get an accurate read, you need to ask a lot of questions. And you're going to ask some easy questions because you've got less able students in there, because we're testing the full spectrum of abilities. And you've got some hard questions in there because you've got some gifted students there as well. But a lot of those questions are going to be around the middle. And because you have to ask a lot of questions, it means you have to ask a lot of them. So, and that's what I mean by a traditional test or a static test, where all students are presented with exactly the same questions in the same order. Yeah. Now, by adaptive, and why is that different? How is that different? Well, an adaptive test will start at a point somewhere in the middle, okay, based on the student's age when they're sitting it. Okay, and the question itself will be generated based on its level of difficulty at random. Okay, and then the next question that the student sees is going to be dependent on their response. So if they're getting the questions correct, then it means the questions themselves are going to get progressively more difficult. If they're getting the questions wrong, then they'll get easier. Now, why do we want to do that? Well, we want to do that because, as I said before, traditional tests have to ask a lot of questions. So what we want to do is we want to chop out as many of those redundant questions as we can. So we don't want to ask overly hard questions to less able students, and because there's no value to it. And we don't want to ask overly easy questions to the more able students. Once again, no value to it. So we want to cut out as many redundant questions as we can. So what we've got in terms of an adaptive assessment, where the questions are based on the student's responses, it means that we're actually going to be able to hone in and target that student's level of ability very, very quickly. Now, as I've said, you're going to get to the level of ability very quick, which means you can test quicker. You can test quicker because you're asking fewer questions. Okay. Now, you can get a more accurate read on this because you're able to ask more questions around the ability of the student as they're going through the test. So we're quicker, potentially more accurate as well. You've got a very personalized experience for the student as well, because once again, it's very unique to them. And the test itself very, very quickly gets to the level of ability of that student. So, which means that they're very engaged in that process, which ultimately means they get a better assessment experience, with the byproduct obviously being, because they're all seeing different questions, you can sit them next to each other in the class because they can't copy off each other. It also means that you've got much more flexibility in terms of how and when you deliver the assessments as well, because you can phase them over time. The ability of a student to leave the test and share actionable insight into the test is heavily mitigated. Once again, they're seeing different questions. So, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking mainly today about Midges and Yellis, and I'm sure lots of you are familiar with Midges and Yellis already, so I'm not going to labour the point, and I'm not going to go through everything on this slide. Needless to say, we test, as I said before, the core areas of vocabulary, verbal ability, and numeracy. We also look at non-verbal ability as well, which is really, really good for triangulating and making sense out of the other two, so the vocab and the maths scores as well. Particularly useful when you've got second language learners in your cohort as well, because ultimately what you're trying to understand is the vocab score an accurate read of their vocabulary based on the context that they're currently within, or are you likely to see a depressed vocabulary score because they're a second language learner, and are you expecting to see that particular score increase at a greater rate than you would normally expect to do with a native speaker, in which case you make some adjustments as you're going through. The non-verbal ability section, because you need very little in the way of language to access it, also you need very little in the way of curriculum knowledge. It means that you get a pretty good read on how mentally agile that the student is when they're going through the assessment. So how How easy is it for them to address and accept new concepts? How easy is it for them to move mentally from one thing to another? So gives you another read. And that's in addition to the vocab and the math score, that's really, really important for you as well. But what type of data do you get? Well, you're going to get what we call baseline data. Now, this is the picture of what is. This is what your students are now, what they're scoring, what their skills and their aptitudes are. This is the information that you're going to get that's going to inform directly what you can do with them in the classroom and from a whole school level straight away. That's your baseline data, that's what you've got. Over time, you can obviously look back at all of this data longitudinally, and you can start monitoring trends over time. This is really important as well because it can give you a really good heads up and a really good context, and especially at whole school level, of exactly how strong or weak a particular cohort might be as they enter into your school. Now, the important one that I know everybody's interested in, and it's always a bone of contention, is the predictive data. So what is going to happen? It sounds a bit like Christmas story, doesn't it? So this is the story of what will be, so the ghost of Christmas future. But the predictive data is a story of what will be or what could be. Okay, so this is going to help you set targets and plan those next steps. And I'll go through a little bit further on, but I would caution at this point, as you're going through all of this data, remember what I said before. This is one piece of research. This is one piece of assessment. This is one bit of data in isolation. So please don't look at it in isolation. Please use it together with the rest of your data. And I'll show a little bit about how we can do that moving forward. Now, value added is the last piece of this puzzle that I'm going to mention at the moment. And for those of you that are not familiar with the term value added, what it means is it's the predicted data, what we predicted would happen, versus what actually happens. So once your students have completed their period of study and you've sent their exam results back, then we have analysis that will map what we predicted would happen against what actually happened. And that is really critical because it helps you create a very real context, a very personal context for your school and the subject within it. So really, really important suite of reports there, really powerful to leverage. Anyway, what can you do as a teacher? Let's start with teachers. Now, importantly as well, we want to be able to understand your class. We want to be able to understand the students within it, and especially at a time when any learning might have been disrupted, or there's been a gap in learning, or the students might be brand new to you. Like I said before, we're not trying to replace anything here. We're trying to fill in a bit of that gap and shortcut part of that process for you, because by understanding the strengths and the weaknesses, then you can start to plan ahead with them. And the sooner you can start to plan ahead, the sooner you can start putting interventions in place, the sooner you can start moving the needle to try and change whatever needs developing or strengthening or moving. It may be seating plans, it may be challenge activities, it may be support activities, it could be group activity, it could be absolutely anything. But a lot of the information that you can get can feed into that directly in the classroom. Now, obviously, we want to be able to use the data to set some ambitious targets, not just ambitious, but they should be realistic as well, and should be part of a dialogue with the student and the parents as well. Often we find that the schools that involve the students and the parents in this dialogue often have the most engagement and insight into what they can do to start moving the needle and improving their results. Obviously, what we want to do is have some hard evidence about student development to back up your end of your assessment as well, where you're going through the teaching, where you go through the assessment at the end of the year. And we obviously want to provide evidence to the parents about the impact of the teaching that we've got as well. So we can say, okay, well, student X is improved by value Y over this period of time. The schools at the start of the year indicated this, so we did that in order to support the student. That support has resulted in this, and the grades have gone up. Fantastic. So you're being able to support evidence what you've done and why you've done it. So I'm going to have a look at a few of the reports I'm going to run through them quite quickly because I'm sure you're all quite familiar with them. But imagine getting a report like this for every student right at the start of the year. This is a profile. This is an ability profile that you get for each student. The red line that you can see in the middle is our lovely average line. So the red line is 100 being the standardized average. So anything above the line, above average, below the line, below average a little bit. The box and whiskers in there that you can see, or the dot and the lines. The dot would be the score, the whiskers would be the confidence limit attached to the score. What you're really looking for is that clear white space between the average and where the bottom or top of the whisker happens to be. This is then starting to show you where those significant results lie. So in terms of this, you've got slightly above average vocab that you can see here. But certainly within the first standard deviation, although their numeracy, the maths results that you've got this particular student's really quite strong. So you've got a very able student, probably greater leaning towards numeracy maths, which probably means they'll perform a bit better naturally when you get to the maths and the sciences. You've got a pretty strong skills section as well. Remember, skills section's got the proofreading section in it. And you've got your non-verbal. Non-verbal is around about average, right on the button, which is neither here nor there. It means that that student is still perfectly able to access a lot of those things. It's just that they still might struggle a little bit with more complicated concepts as they're going through their learning. Okay, so what else have we got? Well, we've got predictions, as I said before. Everybody loves predictions because it's predicting what the future is going to be, and everybody wants a crystal ball. But what nobody wants, or what very few people want, is just a table full of letters and numbers saying this is your grade or your split grade. What you really want to know is the likelihood of the outcome, and this is where we come in here, because the likelihood of the outcome gives you the option to, or the opportunity to have a really rich and informed dialogue with the student and the parents at any given moment. So take this student, for example, you might predict them a grade 6. That's great, you predict them a grade 6. And the question might be, well, why grade 6? Well, that's the most likely outcome. So in the past, and this is how the predictions are formed, so all students of a similar ability level and what they've actually gone on to achieve in the past, that's how all the predictions are formed. So we can see here, students of the similar ability level that this particular student are most likely to come out with a grade 6. But you can see that first bar there, it's a 24% chance. So it's the most likely outcome, but it's not the only outcome. And you can see here the spread has still got quite a bit of variability in it. So yeah, the most likely outcome is a 6. But that 6 is based on, again, it's a horrible word, the average. Okay, now the question that we need to be asking ourselves at this point is your setting average? Is the school average? Is the teacher average? Is the student going to put in the average amount of effort? Will they get the average amount of support when they get home? Will they put the average amount of engagement into their homework? Will they behave in an average way in the classroom? So all of the things that we might note that are going to feed into the end result, all of the other variables, and this is why it's really, really important to start looking at all of the other data sources in the school to create context in this area. Now, here's a very simple example of what you could or might do, or some schools do. Now, this would be for a single student, and the single student would have their subjects down the left-hand side in yellow there, and you can see here we'd have what we might call a chem grade. So this would be the most likely outcome based on the predictions that we've just seen. Now, the next column would be a target grade. Now, the target grade may well be the same as the chem grade, but it may not be. You may choose, based on the other information that you have available to you, to adjust that up or down based on the context and based on the other variables in play. So you create a very unique and informed target for the individual student. And then what you want to do, because you've set the target, and so you've set a direction, a target in the future, you want to make sure the student gets there. So what are you going to do? You're going to measure their academic performance in that subject over that period. And because you're doing that, that's going to help you maintain the trajectory. So you're going to make sure that the student is staying on track. Okay, you're going to include your pastoral data, your behavioural data. How is the student behaving? How much effort are they putting in the classroom? Is their homework on time? Have they engaged with it fully? What do the observations say? What do the classroom teachers' reports say? Okay. Now at the end here, what you can then start to do is you can start mapping what is currently happening against what you expected to happen or your target grid. And then you can do that gap analysis that everybody likes to talk about, which is what's actually happening different to what I expected? Now, in the case of this particular student here, you can see in terms of their sciences and computer science, they're actually pretty much on track and they're quite happy and even above. But you can see in English and history, they're actually quite a way behind. Now, what's going on? Why is this the case? Now, is there a reason for this? Do we understand why? Do we need to adjust our grades, or do we need to adjust our interventions to try and get those grades back on track? So you can start seeing here by putting each of those different bits of data together to create the whole picture. You can start to see how that picture starts to reform and develop, because no one bit of information on that chart will say, you know what, that's the problem, that's what's wrong, that's what we need to do. No one bit of data is going to do that, but by putting them all together, it's actually highlighting some real key areas where you need to be asking some more questions. Now, in this case, it's English and history. There may well be reasons for this. You may well already have interventions in place for this. But if you don't, the earlier you can address it and the sooner you can start putting those interventions in place, means you've got more time to actually move the needle and do something about it. So you can get that trajectory, that flight path back on track. Okay. Now, that's your classroom teacher, but what about from a whole school level? Because senior leaders often have different needs and different wants in terms of their information and their data. Well, this is really quite important, because at this point, you probably want to start aggregating the data a little bit more. So while you're still really engaged and informed about the type of data and the individual students that you've got, you're actually really more interested in probably benchmarking the success of your school. You're aggregating the data up because you want to be able to drive department-wide or school-wide strategies that are going to help improve the performance of the whole school and therefore the students within it. Now, you're going to use CEM, hopefully, to measure the success of those implemented strategies. You're going to be able to use that to review that data over time and understand if that needle's moving in the right direction for you, what you can do and what changes you might want to make. You can also, interestingly, start to provide evidence and objective evidence to prospective parents and governors about how the school's performing. And you can do all of this far ahead of how the school, of what you're actually seeing in the classroom. You can provide the data already, ready to go, and then you can view the data historically looking back as well, which gives you a degree, a little bit of a degree of a crystal ball when you start looking at it. Now, what do I mean? But you aggregate the data. We're not looking at individual students here. We're looking at a cohort. We're looking at cohorts split into 4 quarters: A, B, C, and D. With A being your upper quartile, D being your lower quartile. So in this particular instance, you've got a very able cohort with lots of band A's. Now this comes into this context, and there's really the strength of it is when you start looking at it over time. Because if you take this last bar, for example, you can see band A. Well, that's pretty consistent from year to year, but you can see actually, you've actually got quite a few more band Ds in there as well. Now, if that was the vocab, you might want to look at it in a bit more detail and say, have we got more second language learners? What's driving this? Do we need to put more interventions in place? Do we need to put more remedial writing programs, reading programs in place? Do we need to allocate more time on Lexia? What might it be to address this particular shortcoming? Because the sooner we can start doing something about it, the sooner we can start seeing some results. So what does that then look like when we're looking at it in terms of a plan? A very simple plan that I've got here. I know yours will be a lot more detailed, but certainly in terms of term 1, you're going to have triangulated all of the different data points that you've got, baseline included, and you're going to use that to set some smart targets moving forward. So you're going to set targets for the students, but also for the classroom teachers as well. Term 2, Term 3, you're going to be having those conversations with the parents and the students based on those targets that you set into Term 1. So you can start to understand what's moving the needle and what they can do, because at that point they're feeding into it quite quickly. And then obviously this feeds back around till you get to Term 1 again. Now, if you remember the assessment cycle that we saw before, this is our lessons learned. What have we done well? What have we done not so well? What can we learn from? How can we refine, adapt, and evolve our practice and improve what we do, and to improve the performance of the school? Now, I'm going to take a pause right here. I'm really exciting new news.
It's very exciting news from Ken. We're really pleased to announce the new Cambridge Wellbeing Check that we've introduced. It's going to be launching over the next month, so it will be ready for research from the University of Cambridge. So we've worked with Dr. Ros McClellan at the university there, based on her research, to deliver an assessment that you can use in schools. It's measuring 4 areas of wellbeing. So we're measuring life satisfaction, interpersonal wellbeing, competence wellbeing, and negative emotion. And it's designed so that you can quickly identify students that need more help, students that are having a better time than others, and ideas and interventions that you can use to help improve wellbeing across school. In terms of the format, it's, as all Chem assessments are, it's digital. So it's a student-led questionnaire that they can complete within about 20 minutes on average, and you'll get instant results from it. You'll have reports at individual pupil level, class level, and school level. So you'll be able to see across the school how your students are doing, but also identify very specific areas at pupil level as well. We are also going to allow it to be used multiple times through the year. So if you want to be able to track the efficacy of any interventions you put into place, you can see particular improvements across the year, and you can also identify particular pain points during the year for your students. So I think that's everything on the wellbeing check that I can share with you now. We are going to include a link in the emails that come out to you after the webinar. So if you are interested, you can go onto the web pages there and find out more from us. But I think that's everything from me on the wellbeing check, John. I think that was your presentation completed on the adaptive assessments. I'm just having a quick look at questions. I can't see any more that have come through. We had a couple of people that were interested in receiving the recording of the webinar. So just a reminder that this will come out to you after the in the next few days after the webinar, and you'll have an email in the next hour or so that just gives you a certificate of attendance so that you can prove that you've joined us today. I don't think there's anything else from anybody at the moment, but if you do want to post questions in the chat, I can see the buttons flashing at me, John, so I think any minute now there might be something that comes through. So I'll give you a minute to type questions in and do our best to answer them as always. And then if there's anything that you think of later, you can always drop us a line. So the emails that come out to you will have a reply address, so that if there's anything you think of, then you can let us know. The recording will be available, but also the slides, John, I think we're going to share directly as well. So the full slide deck will go out to you if you want to revisit any of it. And I can still see the buttons flashing, John. So.
Oh, someone's typing. Someone's typing.
We've had a thank you here from David Savage. So thank you, David, for joining us today. And he's thanked you, John, for your presentation.
Oh, thank you, David. It's always a pleasure. And I think for most people, if you're anything like me, the moment we go offline, you'll probably have half a dozen questions will pop into your head. But like Gemma says, just drop us a line. Drop us a line. If you're not sure what that line might be, then that line's on the screen right now.
Okay, I'm going to give it one more minute, John, to see if I can see the last questions coming through.
I've either answered all the questions already, or I've put everyone to sleep.
The sign of a very positive presentation, John, when you've answered everybody's questions before they've even thought of them.
See, I knew I had a crystal ball.
I'm not seeing.
I think it's just taunting you. It's flashing at you.
I think it is. It's flashing at me as if somebody's typing, but it's not actually.
It might be David winding you up.
Yeah, so I think somebody's starting to type, but not actually sending a question. Okay. So question from Julia here. Do you have any videos that show how the tests work as students are completing them? And Julia, yes, we do. We can share those with you actually in the emails afterwards. So we have demonstration videos that will just show the student experience of the assessment. So what it looks like to a student that's completing the tests. John, I don't know if there's anything more you want to add to that.
I would. We could also send Julia some of the links to some of the flat run-throughs where you can actually click through. At the start of each section, for each of the assessments, there are what we call some familiarization questions at the start of each section. So what we've done is we've created I call it a demo of sorts, but it gives you an opportunity to run through what the students would actually see and understand some of the timings in some of the sections that you've got, but also the style of the questions as the students will be running through it. So these are the questions that the students would see as part of their familiarization, but they give you a really good flavour of exactly what the questions and what the style is actually going to be. Was there another one?
Just a thank you from Alex for the presentation.
Welcome, Alex. You're welcome.
I'm reaffirming that it was very thorough, so good work, John.
Oh, thank you very much.
And a thank you from Julia. So
thanks, Julia. Yeah, the one thing that I would add, and I'm sure I've said it a few times in the presentation as well, is that what we offer, what CEM offers, is one piece of the puzzle. Is there support the other pieces of data that you have? And the more you can actually start to pitch that you're going to have, and the better information that you're going to have in order to inform your decision making. If that's the one to take.
Invitation there. Thank you all. As John.
Version available for students that would qualify for it in their summative. So if we're talking about Midgis and Yellis in particular in this case, then there is a 25% extra time version. This is something that you can allocate to individual students, and it obviously will consider those students as individuals. The one thing to note is that obviously those students will get 25% extra time, so we'll obviously be there once the other students have finished them. You may choose to do these students separately so that they all finish around about the same time, or you may do them together and put them to one side. But yeah, there is the opportunity to add extra time. The only thing that we caution is that just make sure the students are going to warrant that extra time when they get to their summative. So if they're going to be due extra time when they get to their summative, then give them the extra time when they've got there. Otherwise, you're going to give perfectly able students another 25% extra time. So, hope that answers the question, Samima.
Yeah, and a thank you from Samima there, John.
Very welcome.
I've still got a flashing light, so I'm still not sure if I've got more questions coming through, John. We'll give it another moment or two and see if there's more flash up.
Oh, that's fine. In fact, I think while we're waiting, I think I will add, I'll add a little story of my own in particular. I think one of the things that you can start to do, and schools generally do, when they come to us in particular, often schools will come and they'll come with a because you've got a particular objective or you've got a problem that you need to solve. I need predictions from which the target's set from. I need to understand my students' abilities. And you come with a very clearly defined and specific objective as to what you want from the product of the assessment. And when you get it, and then obviously that's exactly what you get, and you get that. But the longer you use the assessments and the more you look at the data, the more that journey of adoption for the school in itself continues as well, and the more applications that you see from the data start to present themselves. So, for example, you might start using the data within CPD sessions for the school, where I know for a fact some schools actually use them to challenge assumptions of classroom teachers, because we all make them. It's natural. We'll make an assumption based on a certain student being a certain way, or we're going to achieve in a certain grade. And it's about understanding where those assumptions might lie, because I talked to a school probably a few months ago, and it was the head teacher at the time. We went through the data. He highlighted a particular student. He said, I've got 4 classroom teachers arguing that that particular student, based on their academic results, should be put in special measures. But the scores that I'm seeing here mean he's not only average, but he's actually marginally above average as well. He's more than capable. So what we needed to do, and what the school ended up doing, is they put a panel together, and so they re-evaluated their assumptions. And then they thought, right, well, why is that student performing in that way when they're a perfectly able student? And so the panel themselves then put a suite of interventions in place for a student that were much more targeted to his needs, instead of just putting him into a special measures classroom, which probably would have done much more harm than good. So you can start to see, the more you delve into the data, the more you start attaching it to other bits of data that you've got within a school, the more insight you're going to get from it. And the more insight you get, well, that's more power for you to make decisions. Was there any more?
No.
That's it.
More thank yous, John, but no more questions.
Oh, I'll say more thank yous back. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody. I am going to call it now, John, I think, because I can't see any more questions. But I know the minute I say that, something else will pop up. But I'm going to call it. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Look out for your Chem emails. As John says, there's the contact information on the slide there, but it will also be in the email, so you can get in touch with us and ask us anything you like. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along. Thank you, John, for your sterling work presenting today. And we look forward to seeing you all again at another Chem webinar.